just very briefly about myself. My background is not technical. I'm an IT project manager, and I've been in that position for 35 years or so, working in big global companies such as Reuters, Digital, that merged with Compaq, that merged with HP, and later on I was part of the team that started up Avanade in Denmark. But for the past 14 years I had my own company, and since then I've been only working with agile systems. And I don't know if I dare say that in this audience, but I'm also working with PMI as part of their volunteers on their global initiatives, particularly their agile initiatives. But let me get on with it, and my presentation will be in 3 parts. And the first one, setting the scene. The second one, I'll go into the case study and then finish off with my reflections. And by setting the scene, I'm not only starting in the helicopter, but I'm going straight to the moon. And the reason for showing you a picture of the moon was that at one point in time I was sitting in my summer house an evening, wonderful weather, looking out the window at a bright full moon shining at me, and I was kind of thinking that it reminded me of the work that I was doing. There was something that would always be in the light, which is the method itself. A lot of books are written. We have, for instance, the wonderful KMM, there are blogs, there are YouTube videos, all sorts of things. All of these things are in the dark, but the sad thing is that this is the easier part. The hard part is hidden on the dark side, and those would be some of the examples of the difficult things, the things that you cannot read books about. You cannot even go to the intranet and see, okay, so here, this is our culture and this is how you need to behave. It's something that's just happening without anybody really being very expressed about it. So even though there might be a CEO saying, here in this company we are extremely change ready, this might not be the case at all when you are starting to work with the teams. And another thing that's really disturbing to me is politics. So we have a Danish expression. I'm from Denmark, by the way, and the reason why I'm standing here is that I'm very passionate about Kanban. But when I'm doing these implementations and somebody says, okay, and then came politics, then I have this big red alarm lamp blinking in my head saying, okay, trouble begins now. So all of these things that are hidden, that you cannot read about, they are exactly the things that are going to make you either a success or maybe the opposite, a failure. This was what I had in mind when I started on this, in this organization that had decided to go for Kanban. The organization is a big public organization. It's a university in Denmark, a very renowned one. And I had been in contact with one of the guys from the IT department who had taken Kanban classes, and he was very keen on introducing Kanban in this university. And I was very happy to go and help, but I didn't really know what I was getting into, but that I found out later on. When we look at the organization, there's no big surprise here. There would be an IT manager, there would be a manager of the project managers, there would be an IT development manager, and also a manager of IT infrastructure and operations. But the scope of the work that we did was only the IT development organization and the project management organization too. I'm not really sure why the IT infrastructure, they didn't want to be part of this because they already had a Kanban board. But they had decided, no, we have our own Kanban board and you go and make yours, but we're not going to collaborate very closely. I thought it was quite strange, but this was the situation. This IT department, they were servicing around 30,000 people, and they would be students of the university and anybody working there. The canteen, the administrative personnel, the professors, and so on and so forth. So this is where we started, and what I wanted to do was to use a model that I have made up, inspired by many different things, but based on the experience that I had with previous customers, where the first thing I would do is to try and figure out, why do you want to go agile in the first place? Why did you choose to go for Kanban? What's your problem? What is it that you're trying to fix? And if I cannot have that conversation with my clients, I'm not really very keen on working there. The next thing I will do is to have some awareness workshops, because I don't want it to be a big shock for people. By the way, there's change coming along. So people need to be prepared for that change, to be able to dig into it and really be involved in it. And then step 3, I suggest to train everybody involved. I've seen too many times, and I'm also teaching Scrum, but I've seen too many times people sending off 1 or 2 people on a Scrum Master training course for 2 days, and they expect those few people, even a single person, to go in and do a transformation in an organization, and that's absolutely impossible. It's completely ridiculous. So train everybody that's involved so they know what they are getting into and what they are expected to do and how they're expected to behave. And then we decide how the boards are going to be designed, and also decide what kind of governance model do we want to put around this implementation. Step 5, a plan for continuous improvement, because being a consultant, I might be there for 4 months, 6 months, 8, maybe 1 year, but then I'll go away, and I want people to be able to move on with improvements also after I leave, so that this is a change that's going to stick and not just go away after I leave. And then the very last thing is to challenge the status quo. And in this step, people are looking outside their own team or their own organization to try and figure out how can we work together with the system outside our team, outside our department. So the first steps are kind of team, departmental, internal, and then you expand outside this. I try to use it in this implementation too. Oops. So what did they struggle with? This was the first step. What are your problems in the first place? What is it that you want to solve? And the 2 different teams, the developers and the project managers, they didn't speak too well together. They were, in fact, speaking 2 different languages, and the language was not always very nice. They did not understand each other's problems, and just to give you an example, there was one developer saying, why can't we fire all those silly project managers and hire a couple of developers, because then we can be doing some real work instead of all this administration, whatever these guys are doing. So this is how they were thinking about one another. And of course, poor communication, poor collaboration, and finger pointing. And the blame games, that would be just normal. Everybody would be spending more time explaining why it was everybody else's fault that they didn't deliver to their deadlines, to their promises. And this meant that projects would often be late, budgets overspent, the clients unhappy, the teams were unhappy. And I guess this is a classic, where do your demand come from? And in this organization, it came from basically everywhere. So it would be people writing mails or tapping each other on the back and please, can you help me? Or it might be a mobile phone call or whatever, and they might have project plans. Of course they did, because they had a project management department. But requirements came from everywhere. There was absolutely no predictability and transparency in who worked with what. Nobody really had an idea about where their resources were. And they did this management by Excel, which I suppose that some of you might have experienced sometimes, where they were saying, okay, let's split people. We don't have enough people, so 10% to you and 30 to you, and let's see what's left. 60% goes to you. And that's not very efficient, and particularly not since the resources would distribute themselves somewhere else, so that even if you thought as a project manager that you had resources, it turned out that they weren't there anyway, because the resources themselves had found that there was something that they liked to work with more. And that really isn't very efficient, at least not very predictable. So this is what they wanted to fix. They wanted more predictability, and they wanted more transparency of who was doing what and why. They were also working in silos. That's a classic too. So there was a lot of silo mentality, and people were thinking, as long as I'm feeling good, as long as my team is doing good, I don't really care too much about what happens outside my team. No interest in other people's problems, no idea really of who were the clients. So there was really a lack of value chain thinking, and finally I started off saying that they decided to go for Kanban, but the teams, they believed that they worked Scrumish, that was their own word, but each team did it in their way. So again, many different languages and no predictability. And the management team wanted to fix this. So moving on to step 2, the awareness workshops. Here I was working in an organization that had decided to go for Kanban, where the teams were feeling quite strongly about them being agile, meaning that they work with Scrum, because as everybody knows, Scrum is real agile, or what? At least that's what they think. So me and that internal coach that took the training, we were planning this. We decided to use some questionnaires, and during those workshops made the teams answer some of the questions that didn't really have anything particular to do with only Scrum or only Kanban or anything except Agile good practice. And they could answer yes or no or I don't know. And the funny thing is that one of the questions here is, do you know who your customer is? Do you know your Scrum Master? Do you know who your product owner is? And in many cases they would answer, I don't know. And that would be an indication that they weren't really working with Scrum. But that was easy for me to see, but I wanted the teams to realize that this was the case. And we did this lightweight Scrum and Kanban training, just the highlights, so they could see what are the prerequisites from working with Scrum, and what do we do when we work with Kanban. And then in each and every one of the teams that we trained and had these workshops with, sooner or later somebody would pick up or put up their finger and say, well, I don't really think that we're working with Scrum. I don't really think that Scrum would be the best fit for us. And then they pulled Kanban rather than me pushing Kanban into their throats. So that was a nice position to be in. They decided themselves that, well, we would rather work with Kanban. So that was lucky because the management team had already decided that this was the way to go, but now we had the team on board as well. We also worked with part of the static process, discovering the sources of dissatisfaction, where we were asking the teams, why are you dissatisfied and why are your clients dissatisfied with you? How do they speak about you? Why are they not happy about what you deliver and what makes you unhappy? And then we tried to group it. And the reason for doing this at this workshop was to make the teams realize, well, there's actually something that we can do something about ourselves. We don't need to go to our manager for everything that we find that is that makes us unhappy. We can do something ourselves. So that was really also an eye-opener for these guys that were basically not working much as a team, but all of a sudden realized that together they had some problems that they would like to fix to get a better work day all along. So this is what happened in the awareness workshop, and then we moved on to do the training. And since there was so many things that the management was unhappy about and so many things that they wanted to fix, they had the budget, they had assigned a budget for this training. So we did get to train everybody because they wanted to get off to a good start. There was high management buy-in at this point in time, and I've sometimes found that buy-in is very easy as long as you are on an academic stage, to put it that way. When you're only talking about the theory, but then when you need to put the theory into practice, that's when the fun begins, and that's when you really need the management buy-in. And it wasn't there all the time, but I'll get back to that later on. But at this point in time, management buy-in was there. Then we went on to designing the Kanban boards and the system, and we had big ambitions, this internal Kanban coach and myself. we wanted to build a Kanban system where nothing would fall through the cracks. But since we were in a very, let's call it autonomous or anarchistic organization, the management team said, well, we cannot let the team be fully autonomous about how they want to do things. We need to put a structure around that because we need to get away from this cowboy behavior. So even if I wasn't that happy about the decision, they wanted to have the same Kanban boards for the project managers and the same Kanban boards for all the development teams. And then they said, once they started working with it, okay, then we can loosen the grip a bit and let them decide more for themselves. But they could agree to the team rules, they could agree to definition of ready and done. But in terms of visualization, the management said that we want to look at exactly the same things when we're moving from team to team, so we need to find a common way. And then the management team also wanted the teams to measure because they wanted to see that there was improvements. And this was a big shock to the teams because they had been used to just waking up in the morning, looking at their 20 list long to-do list and saying, well, what do I feel like working with today? And then they would take one task one day and then they would go to task number 6 the next day and task number 4 the next day again. And all of a sudden, the management team wanted them to measure and to be very structured around the way they were working. So that was a big change for these guys. Common board rules, as I said before, they wanted to standardize because they wanted to change the behavior from just doing anything that they felt like to something that was more controlled, more systematic, more managed, controlled. This internal coach had been on KMP training, and we have had an ongoing dialogue. And he definitely wanted class of service to be introduced to these teams. And I was thinking, okay, we are in kind of cowboy land. Will this really work? Will they understand what this is for? But we decided, or rather the internal team or the internal coach suggested that we should do a high, medium, low, which you could argue, is it class of service or not? But anyway, this was something that was quite intuitive to these team members, something that everybody could understand. And they readily bought into it because they could see, well, that's quite logical, that when you have a task, then you should consider, is it very important, or is it just a medium thing, or is it just a low? So that actually worked very well. We also wanted them to write on their tickets, and we had physical boards, by the way, write on the tickets when, if something has been blocked, they needed to use this little purple ticket, and then write when and why it was blocked and what activities had been taken. And they weren't, well, they tried, and it didn't work that well, but at least we got off to a start. They had many ideas about the magnets, so there were a whole load of different magnet colors. And as far as I know, they got away from the green and the yellow magnet later on. But they wanted to show if something was blocked, but there was still an option to take action by themselves. They could do something, and that would be a blue magnet, where the black magnets would be something that's just how things are. You order a server, there's 5 weeks of wait time for that server, and you can't do anything except wait for 5 weeks, and then you can act, of course. And then they would introduce a red magnet for activities that would now be urgent, and the green magnet and yellow magnet, never mind those because they disappeared. And then there were some team rules, and they started off with saying it's a rule we need to measure once a week. And again, that was an order from the management team, so that was not up for discussion. But they also agreed, everyone, that maybe it's nice to know a bit about the activities that we start to work on before we start working on them, instead of getting these oopses, where does that come from? Get a bit of proactivity into the picture. So definition of ready, they understood that, and they made some good ones from the start, and also a definition of done, because they experienced a lot of rework, so they had a quality issue as well. So they found, yes, all right, maybe we should have a look at definition of done. So far so good. So now we have some common board rules. In the project management department, there were not that many project managers, but they had a load of projects going on. When we started off, there was, I guess, around 50 projects or so. And I said, well, this doesn't make sense because you're only so many project managers and you can't work with 3-4 projects each. It doesn't make sense. And then they said, well, we don't really work on 3-4 projects each. But people get so angry when we say that we don't really work on their projects. So we say that they are ongoing, but they're not really ongoing. So I said, okay, that's what somebody might call cheating. So I said, that's really not fair to your customers. This is not a way to go about it. So after having looked at the capacity, kind of not very detailed, but just like gut feeling, we got to the point where we could reduce the projects to 7. So instead of 50, we now had 7 projects because we did this activity saying, okay, so what do you really need to complete right now? The Spice Girl question. Tell me what you want, what you really want. And that summed up to these 7. And before that, what I forgot to say just before was that we are in a Danish public organization. There are rules around how you need to deal with big projects. You need to follow a certain process. You need to have a business case. You need to analyze your benefits. You need to have a requirement specification, and then you are ready to start. And being a public organization, they also work with Prince2, and this is what you can see when you look at the process here, where you can see the phases of some of the phases of the Prince2 model. And there would only be highlights about these projects and what we would show. So how are we doing? And for that, I talked about those 7 projects. Delete what I just said. We'll go back to this discarded thing because, as mentioned before, they weren't really very good at saying no, and that's a classic too. But now they started to really look seriously into the projects and saying, okay, is this ever going to make it to the top? No, probably not. Okay, let's discard it. Let's have a conversation with the person who wanted this project and say you're not going to get it. And that was really a tough thing because people tend to think that they are there to say yes and to help their colleagues. But we discussed, well, you're also there to protect your scarce resources and the economy you have to deliver these projects. So you need to prioritize. So this was very new for them to start to say no and start to discard things. These 3 stoplights, they started off with 3 columns saying if everything is going all right, it stays in the green column. If it's being kind of difficult, then it ends up in the yellow. And if something is really wrong or it starts to become really risky, it ends up in the red. Later on, they changed that, so they switched the stoplights with magnets instead. But I thought that it was actually, it's quite simple, but it really worked. It did work quite well. And the project managers and the manager of the project managers, they met once a week to have a discussion about how are we doing project-wise. Is it going as we expect and as we want, or do we need to take action of some sort? And then to the project Kanban board. And you might wonder why we already here in immature teams decided to introduce both upstream and downstream boards. But again, the internal coach, very ambitious. We need to go both for upstream and downstream boards. And some people actually took it in. Some of the project managers, they thought that this was quite logical. This is a nice way to work, and I get to have this funnel so that I can sort the activities getting into my board. And other people, they didn't get it at all. But we were happy that at least some got it, and we got off to a start, and then we expected that knowledge would flow between the project managers as we moved along. But again, you would have a process for looking at upstream activities, and you would have a different process when you had started working on an activity, analysis, detail, split, and ongoing. And again, you would have these stoplight columns to make it very visible. How are we doing with this particular task? And remember date in and date out, that's because they were not really used to measuring, and they wanted to measure, or we wanted to measure lead time and throughput, so they needed to have that information to be able to calculate that. They had a series of work item types, and you might wonder, why are we having, again, discarded? We took that on to the project boards as well. And that was a difficult thing for the project managers too, so not only to say no to projects from the PMO point of view, but also starting to really evaluate, do we really need to do this task, or can we live without it? But we slowly we got there. They were also keeping track of third-party tasks, and of course they can't decide how third-party vendors are going to work with their stuff. It's up to them entirely. But when they were depending on third-party deliveries to be able to move on with their own deliveries, they put on the tasks of these third-party vendors so that they could proactively follow up and make sure that things happened at the time that it was needed. They did have an expedite swim lane. So again, they had this kind of classes of service, high, medium, and low, and then the expedite as well. And then they added a information column because they wanted to keep track of important activities going on in that particular week. That has nothing to do with Kanban, but they felt that it would be beneficial for them to visualize if they were going live with something, or if somebody was sick or going on a training course or whatever, so that it was very easy to figure out what's happening, keeping track of who does what. So now we've been PMO down to the projects, and now we move to the Kanban, the team Kanban board. In this case, there were 5 members. So that meant that if you were not allocated to a project and you were a developer, then you could do some development work on the systems that this particular part of the development team here was responsible for. So if you weren't on a project, you would be working on this. In this board on activities that had been deemed relevant in this particular team. Again, we have the same process upstream, the same process downstream. They were also working with work item types, but this time it was different because now we were in a development team. And they also tried to practice saying no. And again, it's very difficult when you're kind of a can-do person. And we had many discussions about this because they said, well, we are here to help our colleagues. We are part of the organization that are supporting everybody in this university. So you can't expect us to say no when people are calling in. And I said, no, I don't really expect you to say no, but I expect you to look at what they're asking for and trying to figure out, so where does it fit in your backlog? You don't necessarily have to throw everything away that you were sitting with just to go to this new thing so that it becomes last in, first out. Instead, you need to figure out, so what needs to happen with this task, put it upstream, and then try to distribute it in, unless it's an expedite, and then, of course, it's kind of an all-hands-on-deck situation and just need to fix it. Again, we are trying to introduce some new habits, some new way of thinking in this system. And also in this team, they had an information column where they would have parking lots for magnets. So if they were in projects, you could see that. If they were sick or out of the office or whatever, then it would be in the parking lot. If you were in a project, it would be in this particular place. They had a responsibility for support of their systems, so they were taking turns each week, so to make it easy to see, okay, so who's on the support this week? They put the name up here. Again, has nothing to do with Kanban, but it worked well for this team, and it gave the managers a very nice overview about where are our resources and who's doing what. And we had this general principle that what you can't see on the Kanban boards doesn't exist. And then, okay, back to reality. Of course, something happened, the tap on the back and the emails and the telephones, but we were trying slowly to change the mindset and making it okay to say, well, thank you for this, but I'm going to put it on. Actually, we introduced a flip over chart, so when new things arrived, they would put it there and they would discuss it at their daily meetings and say, okay, so what do we need to do with these new requests? So it was a very controlled system, and not everybody liked it that much, because when you're working with these kind of people, not that there's anything wrong with them, that's not what I'm saying, but they were just used to waking up and asking their stomach, so what do I feel like today? It was not like what's best for my organization to work with today, or what did I leave yesterday and what should I continue working on. So this was a big change in the way they were working, and not everybody was as happy about it as this internal Kanban coach. But they accepted it. What was also hitting productivity and hitting predictability were cross-team dependencies, and they were all over the place. So we tried to make this system, and that's quite simple as well, but again, it's something that's understandable, and I tried it out at several clients, and usually it works really well. They were distinguishing between dependencies where nothing much would happen if it was postponed for a week or a couple of weeks maybe. But if there were urgent dependencies, that would mean that if I don't get this deliverable at this particular time, then something bad is going to happen. We're going to have a whole project team being unable to do anything, or something that would be really costly. And then we would have a small blue sticker if something new had turned up since last time we spoke. And we would be looking at 7 weeks rolling, so all you needed to do on this board was to change the week number, once a week. And then you would note, okay, so if you were depending on team 1 in week 33, you would put, like you see here, a yellow sticker here explaining why do I need this dependency and who needs to do it, is it a specialist or whatever. And if something urgent, as I mentioned before, it would be on a red sticky. And if there were conflicts, as you can see there is in week 39 in team 3, there would be 2 critical dependencies at the same time, looking for the same kind of resource or specialist. Therefore, we needed to have managers on board being in these meetings, and we met twice a week in front of the board, looking at what has happened since last time we met. In case of conflict, we would have decision power there. And we would have the manager say, okay, so since you can't clone people, not yet at least, we need to decide, okay, in week 39, who gets this resource first? Okay, first you, then you. And then they would clean up the board and they would move along. So it's quite simple and quite powerful. Everybody was quite happy about this being controlled in a way so you got away from these oopses, I need this specialist. Once you started working with things, so you already before you start work, you try to figure out, do we have dependencies, and if you do, you visualize them on this board. Then there would be some board rules, make rules explicit. So everybody knew what they were looking at if they went in front of this board. And now we have a system where you can see the teams, the development teams involved, and also the management. Sometimes you are in the need of a management decision, or you need to know, do you want us to go left or right around this? So the management was also on this board because they had this structure, again, this being a public organization, where there wasn't that much delegation of decision power. And also external, if you were depending on something from outside. And this is easy to say, and it's not so easy to do, because I mean, it's very easy for me to draw a couple of boards here, but actually this is what they look like, and in some cases they work really nice, but in some cases it didn't really work that well. So it was a little of each, you could say. Planning for continuous improvement, we started to keep it simple, so we measured system lead time and throughput, nothing more. And And again, sometimes I get over the top, being over ambitious. I wanted to measure number of blockers, since that was something that they really wanted to fix. And they also had a quality issue, so I wanted to measure new errors arriving compared to old errors corrected. But people, they just couldn't have it, so I needed to go away from that. But instead we decided, in every retrospective, we'll have a look at the 6 general practices and see how are we doing. So that was not bad, I didn't think, at least. And challenging the status quo, and if you don't plan how to continue it, that's my experience so far, there is a reason that everything is going to fade and get back to what they used to be doing. So we decided to, we talked to the management team to figure out, so what can you do to make sure that this doesn't stop after I have left? And in the pipeline was maturity assessments. I'm not a big fan of that, but management teams are very often a big fan of maturity assessments. And also common views on what is agile behavior and what is the culture that you want to create here. And then process improvements, both cross-team but also outside the team, cross-departmental. And what I found up to now, that if I'm working with immature teams, I really need some management buy-in and back up behind me, because otherwise not much is going to happen. Right now I'm working with 2 different clients. One I have strong management buy-in, and the other one not so much. And the first one is just moving very quickly, and things are changing very rapidly. The other, really not that quick. So looking at my most important learnings here, leadership, and that's no surprise for Kanban people, because that's part of it, leadership at all levels. And as I said before, as long as it's academic, it's easy to say, yeah, I'm directly behind you. But once reality hits, that's a different matter. And I would find that in one department there was backup, in the other one not so much. So anarchy started to again bubble over here. So that was a harder job to be a coach for these guys. But that's just how it is. And when we're looking at the 6 core practices, again, it sounds easy, it's not that easy. But for instance, visualizing, there were many that found transparency intimidating. It was like, usually they would be sitting behind their desks, and some of them buried in big piles of paper, and all of a sudden you insist that what you're working on, that's something that we would all like to know. And they found that that was not really very comfortable. I don't know why, but that's how it was. And then limiting work in progress. I have had numerous discussions with numerous teams saying, well, we're not really efficient if we don't have our to-do list of 20, 30 things. So limiting work in progress, that means that nothing is going to happen. And sometimes I just need to say, well, humor me. Can we try it out for just a couple of weeks or a month, and then we see what goes on? Usually we get to the agreement, okay, if nothing else, let's limit it so it's 2-3 tasks per person. And I had one incident where somebody that was really aggressive and angry and didn't get it at all came after a month's time and said, well, actually, after a week's time, my shoulders fell down. And I felt a big relief from not having this big to-do list or long to-do list. And all of a sudden, I could focus. For the first time in ages, I've been able to focus on what I'm doing. So that was a big relief. And I thought it was actually great that a person that was really unhappy with the idea of limiting work in progress came back and said, by the way, you were right. It was really a relief. The other thing, or the third thing I would mention is that, yeah, rules, that's good. We're sitting here in our team workshop, explicit rules, yes, great, we all know what's going to happen. And that's all fine until you start working with it. And then some people tend to think that rules are very good for all the others, but the way that I'm doing things, that's a bit better, so I just continue doing whatever I did. So again, you need to get them back, and we have to discuss, as I said, each retrospective we would discuss this and discuss why are we not following the rules if that was the case. Not being a policeman, but for these guys to realize they are our rules. It was not me who came and enforced those rules on them. They made them themselves. So they're actually cheating their team and themselves when they're not following the rules. And by the way, it becomes completely unclear what we are looking at if we're doing things in 10 different ways. In these teams, the team's values, they were also very different. And I realized, I guess that the recommendation for Great Boss, Dead Boss came at one of the Kanban training classes, and I read it and I was blown away. But I understood, but that was too late because that was after, I read the book after this incident. But the power of team values and tribal behavior, don't estimate that. We had teams having each their sets of values, and as an example, I can say that there was one team having worked in a different part of the organization where they had their own team or IT department, and they were merged, but they were still speaking about themselves as we are the guys that are doing work for this part of the organization. So they didn't really feel integrated in this IT department, and they were really like, oh, this Kanban, this is for all these other guys, but we are different. And they were an example of a team that didn't get that far very quickly. And also there was a lack of a common vision. Why are we here? What are we doing? We are servicing 30,000 people in this organization, and we are proud of it. And my conclusion was we need to define, or if it's possible to define something that everybody can agree on, that this is our purpose in our work life, then I think I would have been at a better stage. And I also realized that people actually like to have these enemy pictures. They were a bit reluctant to give them up because it felt so comfortable that they could say that we are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and the reason why we are not a success is because they are the bad guys. So keeping up those enemy pictures and having this tribal behavior is really not a good thing when you want to create a new way of working. But this was just the fact of this organization. And when I was working with the project managers, it was next to impossible to leave these old estimation practices. So even though they realized that task switching and wait times and blockers and dependencies, they resulted in poor estimates, they never hit the nail. They never ever hit that bullseye that they were trying to hit when they did the estimation. Still, it felt so comfortable to keep on doing what they knew weren't working, but it wasn't working in a way that they were very used to. So they didn't want to leave that practice, and it was simply too big a bite to swallow that they can use lead time to create predictability, because lead time is a distribution and all of these things that you guys know all about. But I wasn't able really to persuade them at that point in time, but maybe next time I'm more lucky, because I'm sometimes back in the organization working with them to see what kind of improvements can we make together. Yeah, I guess I've been speak talking. I have 5 minutes, but I'm not going to spend them. But my key takeaways from this organization, it was that in change projects and Kanban implementations as well, it's all these invisible things that are seeping through the organization and happening every minute of the workday. Those are the things that make things difficult. It's not the method, it's not the framework, but all of the things that's very difficult to do something about. And I also, maybe that's my old project management genes that are talking here, but I do think that you can plan transformations. You need to set some goals up front so you know in which direction you're moving and what you're aiming at. And that goes back to this point number one. You need to find out what are the pain points, what is it that you're trying to fix when you're going agile, and then try to make some goals that you can steer towards, and also to be realistic and pragmatic. And as a matter of fact, that's when I heard, whenever I've been talking about Kanban to anybody, it's the pragmatic, it's the concept of being pragmatic and being realistic that really makes people listening, because they're so used to getting these big solutions, Scrum and Safe, that requires a lot of changes, and people get very relieved when they hear, well, you don't have to change everything. You don't need to get sorry to be a bit strange in my wording maybe, but a brain transplant to work in this context, because you are who you are. If you are introvert, you're introvert. If you're extrovert, you're extrovert. But you can work in this system as long as we can agree on some rules and we can follow the rules, so we know what we are aiming at. And don't set the bar too high. And I just mentioned a few examples about when I have been setting the bar too high, overreaching, wanting to do too much too soon. But then again, I learned from that, and I tried not to repeat that the next time I went to a new client. And again, one thing is the method, another thing is the people. You have the people that you have, and particularly in public organizations in Denmark, you don't get to pick all the best possible people. You have the people you have, and you don't go around firing them if they are not change ready or not willing to do the things that you would like them to do. So that's just a fact. That's just how things are. And then, as a note to myself and a reminder, look out for tribal behavior, because that can really kill a lot of good things that you're trying to do if you don't deal with it somehow, and if you can. In this case, I couldn't, because that tribe was so strong, and they had been allowed to behave as tribes for I think it was 5 years. So coming in from the outside, you can only do so much. It's not as an excuse, it's more like just this is how it was, just a fact. And if you want to connect, please feel free to do so. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and all the rest of it. And then time for questions. And I'm 2 minutes before my time.
Can you go back to the last slide?
I'm sorry? Yeah, sure.
Do we have any questions?
You mentioned semi-hostile teams in your title. What about semi-indifferent teams, ones who don't really care?
Semi-different teams? Indifferent teams. Well, they were there as well. I mean, the hostility, just as an example, there was one of the developers pointing his finger at me and say, I've been here for 25 years. You don't know what I'm working with. What are you trying to tell me? You don't know anything about my job. And then I was thinking, oh wow, I'm just talking about Kanban and the 6 practices and all the rest of it. So that was part of the hostility, and people sitting like this, not wanting to change anything. But in different teams, I don't think they were really indifferent. It was either, well, this sounds great, this sounds fine, because, I mean, those guys have eyes in their heads, so they know that things are not going to in the best possible way. So there were many of them that were ready for the change, but there were some people that really felt that being that kind of cowboy guy shooting at everything that moves and feeling this, I'm a can-do person, yes, I help my colleague, instead of saying, okay, am I doing the best possible thing for the organization? I didn't really find anybody in this case that was completely indifferent. If you mean that are people just accepting whatever you're coming with, yeah. There were a few of those as well, and that's fine, but I think the next time somebody comes with another idea, they'll be fine about that as well. So, I mean.
So sometimes indifferent people are harder to help change, because at least the hostile people are interacting.
Yeah, at least you can have a discussion, you can have a debate with them, but the other ones, they're just floating along, so.
They're both hard.
Maybe I haven't cared enough about those indifferent people, so.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Right over there.
the inevitable question. All of your examples were of manual boards. Did you consider using tools? Were you forced to use tools during the pandemic, or have they started to adopt tools now, or what's the tools question?
Yeah, that's a tools question, and that's a good one too, because what I am not very happy about is when the tool is forcing you to work in a different way than you actually want to work. So in this case, they insisted that they would start using physical boards, even though many of the developers said, well, why don't we use a tool? And we've got Jira, and we've got this and that and the other. But again, I've seen in so many cases that the information is just disappearing in those tools. You don't get that transparency. But what has happened during the pandemic, I guess that the physical boards died for a moment. Then we try to put them back to life, but where they are at right now, I can't really tell. But again, sitting at home, we can't have each a copy of that physical board, so they died, unfortunately. But I prefer to start using physical boards until they get a feeling for what they're working with, and then try to transform if it needs to go into a software. And sometimes it does, because distributed teams, people working across boundary or across borders and all the rest of it, well, it doesn't really work that well with physical boards. But during the pandemic, the physical boards died.
Hi, thank you. It's not a question, but a comment. I saw your PMO board where you have the columns with green, yellow, red kind of. Similar to that, I have my personal Kanban board in my kitchen. Everything is Kanban. My husband goes crazy with the yellow stickies, but everything is Kanban. But for me, the same as green, yellow, red, I do have the stickies of anything I have to work on, like cook and grocery shopping, everything kind of Kanban for me, right? So when it is half empty, kind of, it's yellow. So I turn the sticky sideways, that means it's yellow. If I turn the sticky upside down, that means it's red. I have to pay attention. I have to buy immediately. So it's like something like that. So anytime I go grocery shopping, anytime I look at my fridge, I take a picture of it and then plan on it. I really don't have to open the fridge and plan. I really don't have to look for my grocery inventory to go and buy. Kind of like I really connected with that board with yellow, red, green kind of. So I use the same sticky sideways, upside down. So that worked for me.
Nice, nice.
Thank you.
I guess it's those visualization techniques, they are so strong, so it's not that I go and say you must do this or that, but it's more like opening your toolbox and say, well, there are all these things, what do you like? Do you like colored stickies, magnets? But this is a new one, and I'll make sure to remember it. So thanks for that.
I think that concludes. We've got time for one more, and then it's time to go hang out.
In terms of hostile teams, when you were talking about that, did you encounter teams that would actually, with their enemies, cards up, point to other teams perhaps that were working with Kanban and try to sow like anti-Kanban propaganda and undermine the process as you were going through this?
Yeah, I mean, there were some of these people, as I mentioned, they were working Scrummish, and some were feeling that this Kanban, that's not agile. We want to be agile. And it's again, if you're immature and you don't know what you don't know, then you might see these people that are working against it, and I certainly did, because you can hear it and sometimes they are talking loud on purpose so that Annette doesn't hear. And then they would say, well, I wish we were still working in sprints. Why can't we work in sprints? And if we had a product owner, then this, that, and the other. And so it will come out ever so subtle. But it's, yes, you would find those people, because they are, sometimes there are immensely strong feelings. Instead, like several of the speakers has mentioned, it's not Kanban or Scrum. It's what can we do? What do we have in our toolbox that will work here? But this is not always what people are feeling, because they are more concerned about my method is better than your method, and stuff like this that really is ridiculous, and that conversation is just difficult to have with these people. So I would try to be, what do you call it? We call it Teflon kind of shirts on, and then just smile and say yes, but yeah, now we try it out and so on. And all of a sudden, when they have worked with it for a while, they don't really start talking about sprints anymore, because it's just become a more natural way to work. So then those discussions ends. But in the beginning, certainly, there were quite a few being angry about not being allowed being agile working with Scrum. So. I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Now.
There it was.
You've mentioned leadership, and from my experience working with universities, most of the time it's leadership has left the building. It's either very traditional or not present. And from this hostility, I would expect, if it was an organization like, okay, get some leadership in and try to work with it or get some guidance. So did you get any support from leadership or whatever structures has been there?
Yeah, you're right. University structures are very strange in many ways, because who gets to decide? The professors, the powers of the professors that's very strong, and sometimes you would see stuff getting pushed outside IT management and what have you, and if they didn't do what they wanted, they would escalate, and that just makes it difficult. But again, lack of leadership. There was one leader that was very supportive, and another one not so much, because he wanted to be this nice guy. I hope I'm not offending anybody here, because that's not my intention. But he wanted to be friends with his teams, right? Or with his teams. He had several teams. So when you were discussing stuff that didn't really work well, or rules that they had all agreed to, but they were broken, and I needed support from the manager. Not because I can't go in and say, by the way, guys, you're breaking the rules, but because some of the teams, they didn't care about me. What do you know? You're from the outside. You can't decide anything for us. And again, that's part, I guess, of the immaturity. But because had they been more mature, they would probably have been ready for the changes or the stuff that they came up with themselves. And in that case, I would have loved to have a manager and say, by the way, you need to do this because I say so. And even if that's not my preferred style of management, if you want to introduce those changes, the less mature the teams are, the more necessary it is that the manager is putting down some stones in the ground and say, you can do whatever you want inside those stones, but don't go outside. I don't want you to go outside. And that was not the kind of support I was getting here. So you're right, and I guess that's from my experience in Danish public organizations. That's often the case, and certainly it was here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you.